The hum of the engines was a familiar lullaby, a monotonous drone that cradled the passengers of American Pride Flight 29 in the artificial twilight of their red-eye journey. Most were asleep, their heads lolling against uncomfortable pillows, their breaths shallow and rhythmic. Among them was Brian Engel, a commercial pilot, off-duty and exhausted, dreaming of a much-needed vacation. He had left Boston on a whim, escaping the grief of a shattered marriage and a personal tragedy that still echoed in the quiet corners of his mind. Beside him, Dinah Bellman, a precocious and blind young girl on her way to Boston for eye surgery, slept fitfully, her sensitive ears picking up the subtle shifts in the aircraft's rhythm, even in slumber. Across the aisle, Nick Hopewell, a taciturn British agent, a man of precise movements and a cool demeanor, also rested, though his rest was more a state of heightened readiness than true sleep. His presence exuded a quiet danger, a man accustomed to lurking in the shadows of international intrigue. Further back, Craig Toomey, a high-strung businessman, twitched and muttered in his sleep, the anxieties of his financial world bleeding into his unconscious. Laurel Stevenson, a teacher, kind and weary, dozed, her hand resting on a book that had slipped from her grasp. There was also Don Gaffney, a gentle giant of a man, a writer, who had recently lost his daughter, and Albert Kausner, a young, aspiring author, absorbed in his own thoughts. Bethany Sims, a rebellious teenager, was lost in the world of her Walkman, and Bob Jenkins, a mystery writer, observed the sleeping tableau with a detached, professional curiosity. Brian awoke with a jolt, not from a dream, but from an unsettling silence. The engines, though still running, seemed to have lost their deep, throbbing resonance. More disturbingly, the cabin was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He looked around. The other passengers were gone. Not just a few, but all of them. The seats were empty, save for a few discarded magazines, a crumpled napkin, a half-eaten bag of peanuts. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. A sudden, cold dread squeezed his heart. He reached for Dinah, his hand brushing against the empty seat beside him. His heart hammered against his ribs. Panic began to claw at him. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the deserted cabin, his mind struggling to process the impossible. He wasn't alone, however. A few other passengers were also stirring, their faces reflecting his own dawning horror. Laurel Stevenson, her eyes wide with disbelief, slowly rose from her seat. Don Gaffney, the large writer, peered around with a bewildered expression. Albert Kausner, the young writer, looked utterly lost. Bethany Sims, her headphones still on, seemed oblivious until she finally removed them, her jaw dropping at the empty rows. And then there was Nick Hopewell, already on his feet, his hand instinctively going to the small of his back, a silent testament to his training. Brian, being a pilot, quickly took charge, his voice firm despite the tremor of fear that threatened to unravel him. He tried the intercom, but it was dead. He tried the cockpit door, it was unlocked. Stepping inside, he found it deserted, the controls cold and still. The co-pilot's seat was empty, the pilot's seat equally so. The flight instruments, however, were still functioning, glowing with their familiar green and amber lights. This was not a power failure. This was something far, far worse. As the remaining passengers gathered, a strange assortment of individuals united by this inexplicable event, Craig Toomey, the frantic businessman, began to unravel. His composure, always fragile, shattered completely. He ranted about a vital business meeting, about the time, about the Langoliers, a childhood boogeyman his father had used to scare him into obedience. His hysterical cries added another layer of terrifying surrealism to the situation. Brian, with the help of Nick and Don, tried to piece together what had happened. They were flying at cruising altitude, but the silence was profound. There was no static on the radio, no response from air traffic control. It was as if the entire world outside their plane had gone silent, vanished. Dinah, the blind girl, however, offered a chilling insight. She could smell something, something putrid, something like old toast. And she could hear something, a faint, persistent rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a pavement. Her words, though cryptic, sent shivers down their spines. The realization slowly dawned on them. They had flown through some kind of temporal anomaly. They were no longer in their own time. The air in the plane felt stale, somehow thinner, and even the light seemed to have lost its vibrancy, appearing duller, almost washed out. Brian made the decision to land the plane. He had to. He couldn't keep flying aimlessly into this terrifying void. Their best bet was to reach the nearest airport. He chose Bangor, Maine, a relatively quiet airport, hoping to minimize any potential chaos upon landing. The descent was unsettlingly smooth, the lack of air traffic control communication adding to the eerie silence. As they approached the runway, the sight that greeted them was a fresh wave of horror. The airport was deserted. The tarmac was cracked and crumbling, weeds growing through the asphalt. The buildings were silent, devoid of life, their windows like vacant eyesores. No lights, no ground crew, no other planes. It was a ghost airport. A ghost world. They managed a rough landing, the plane bumping and skidding before coming to a halt on the deserted runway. The instant the plane stopped, the bizarre sensory changes intensified. The air outside was absolutely still, heavy and lifeless. The colors were muted, as if the world had been drained of its vitality. There was no wind, no sounds of nature, no distant rumble of a city. It was a vacuum of existence. Stepping off the plane felt like stepping into a dream, or rather, a nightmare. The ground felt different, somehow less substantial, like walking on a forgotten stage. The trees around the airport were strangely uniform, their leaves a flat, uninspired green. The silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket that pressed down on their eardrums, broken only by their own fearful breaths and Craig Toomey's increasingly frantic babbling. As they explored the abandoned airport, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. They found evidence of human activity, a half-eaten hot dog, a discarded newspaper, but it was all strangely preserved, as if time had stopped for these objects, yet not for them. The food, though visually intact, tasted utterly flat, devoid of flavor. The newspaper, when read, offered news of a world that had seemingly vanished. They were truly alone, adrift in a temporal void. Dinah's heightened senses became their most valuable asset. She kept hearing the rustling, a sound that grew steadily louder, more insistent. She described it as a munching sound, like 1,000 mouths chewing. Craig Toomey, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate, his rants becoming more aggressive, his fear of the Langoliers turning into a terrifying obsession. He believed they were coming for him, for everyone, to eat up the wasted time. Brian, trying to maintain a semblance of leadership, led them to the airport terminal, hoping to find some answers, or at least some form of communication. The terminal was as deserted as the rest of the airport, but inside, they discovered a startling phenomenon. The electricity still worked, yet it provided no real light or power. The lights flickered weakly, and the vending machines, when tried, produced food that was utterly tasteless, like cardboard. It was as if the energy was there, but it had no substance, no true life. Their discovery of the Langoliers came, as most horrors do, unexpectedly. Dinah's increasing agitation, her desperate cries about the growing sound, forced them to look out of the terminal windows. In the distance, approaching from the horizon, a monstrous sight materialized. They were large, spherical creatures, their bodies bristling with sharp, rotating teeth. They moved with a disturbing, almost mechanical efficiency, consuming everything in their path. They devoured the ground, the trees, the buildings, leaving nothing but a smooth, featureless void behind them. Craig Toomey's screams of, "The Langoliers! They're coming, they're eating time," suddenly made terrifying sense. These were the creatures of his childhood nightmares, brought to life, and they were indeed devouring the past, erasing everything that had ever been. The realization that they had flown into the past, and that the past was being consumed by these relentless entities, was a blow to their very sanity. The group was thrown into a desperate scramble for survival. They had to get back on the plane, and they had to fly forward in time, away from the encroaching devourers. Brian, ever the pilot, understood the gravity of their situation. They needed fuel, and they needed to act fast. Their plan was fraught with peril. As they raced back to the plane, the rumbling and grinding sounds of the Langoliers grew deafeningly loud. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the creatures drew closer, their monstrous jaws gnashing at the very fabric of existence. Craig Toomey, his mind completely broken, became a dangerous liability. He lunged at Dinah, believing her to be an obstacle, convinced she was somehow connected to the Langoliers. Nick Hopewell, acting instinctively and decisively, was forced to intervene, incapacitating Toomey to protect Dinah. The act of refueling the plane became a desperate race against time. The air around them grew thick with the smell of decay, a tangible manifestation of the Langoliers' destructive work. As the last drops of fuel flowed into the tank, the ground literally began to disappear behind them, eaten away by the advancing creatures. The sight of the airport, the runway, the terminal, all being systematically devoured, was a horrifying spectacle. With the Langoliers rapidly approaching, Brian knew they couldn't afford to waste a single second. The passengers scrambled back onto the plane, their faces etched with terror. Craig Toomey, still dazed but now largely compliant after Nick's intervention, was dragged aboard. The engines roared to life, a welcome sound after the oppressive silence, and Brian pushed the throttle forward, sending the plane hurtling down the shrinking runway. As the plane lifted off, they looked back to witness the chilling tableau. The Langoliers, a monstrous army of spherical teeth, consuming the very earth where they had just stood, leaving behind an utterly blank, featureless void. The world they had briefly inhabited was gone, devoured. Now airborne, the next challenge was how to re-enter their own time. Brian theorized that they needed to fly through another temporal rip, a similar phenomenon to the one that had brought them into the past. However, there was no way to predict where or when that might happen. They were flying blind, trusting in a desperate hope. The mental toll of their ordeal began to manifest in various ways. Craig Toomey, though subdued, continued to suffer from intense paranoia and hallucinations, his Langoliers, now an inescapable reality. The others, though more resilient, grappled with the profound existential dread of having witnessed the end of a temporal reality. The silence inside the plane, once a source of unease, now felt like a fragile sanctuary, a brief respite from the ultimate annihilation they had just witnessed. As they flew on, the journey became an exercise in suspended animation. They were suspended between two realities, unsure if they would ever reach their own. The air inside the cabin became increasingly oppressive, the taste of the tasteless food, the dullness of the light, all reminders of the temporal anomaly they were trapped within. Then, just as despair began to set in, Dinah, the blind girl, announced a change. She could smell the familiar scent of wood smoke, of living things, of life. And she could hear the faint, distant sounds of the present, the hum of electricity, the whisper of wind, the distant rumble of traffic. They were approaching another rip, a gateway back to their own time. The re-entry was violent, a sudden jolt that rattled the entire plane. The world outside the windows shimmered and twisted, a kaleidoscope of colors and forms, before snapping back into focus. The familiar vibrant hues of the present returned, the air inside the cabin felt lighter, and the hum of the engines regained its comforting throb. They were back, but the ordeal was far from over. They were low on fuel, and they needed to land immediately. Brian chose Bangor again, hoping that this time, it would be a living, breathing airport. As they descended, a crucial, terrifying realization struck them. The problem with temporal travel wasn't just entering the past, it was leaving it. When they re-entered their own time, they brought with them the accumulated, dead, energy from the past, the residue of the time that had been eaten by the Langoliers. This dead energy was still inside them, still inside the plane. And it was highly combustible. As the plane touched down on the runway, a critical problem emerged. The plane, still laden with the dead energy, was rapidly overheating. The metal groaned and warped, smoke began to seep from the vents, and the smell of burning plastic filled the cabin. They had to get off the plane, and they had to do it immediately, before it exploded. The Langoliers had been an external threat, a horrifying manifestation of time's end. Now, the threat was internal, a ticking time bomb within their very vehicle of salvation. The passengers, still reeling from their previous trauma, were faced with yet another desperate race against time. They rushed to the emergency exits, the smoke thickening, the heat becoming unbearable. The sense of urgency was absolute. As they streamed out onto the tarmac, they heard the groaning and popping of the plane behind them. They ran, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the doomed aircraft. They reached a safe distance just as the plane finally succumbed. With a catastrophic roar, the American Pride Flight 29 exploded in a fireball of twisted metal and burning fuel. The sound ripped through the air, sending shockwaves across the empty runway. The sight was horrifying, a stark reminder of the thin line between their survival and total annihilation. They stood there, a small, huddled group, watching the inferno, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. They were alive, but profoundly changed. The world they had returned to was indeed their own, but it was still silent, still empty. The airport was deserted, just as it had been in the past, but this time, it was their own present that felt empty. They hadn't landed at a living airport, they had landed at their own airport, but it was still somehow devoid of human life. This realization brought with it a fresh wave of despair. They were back, but what had they returned to? The world was there, the buildings, the air, the familiar sights, but the people were gone. Had everyone vanished? Had they somehow returned to a different, empty version of their own present? It was Bob Jenkins, the mystery writer, who put the pieces together. He posited that when they flew through the temporal rip, they had not only returned to their own time but had also entered a precise, infinitesimally small moment before the present caught up to them. They were in the present, but a fraction of a second ahead of everyone else. The dead energy they carried, the residue of the Langoliers' feast, was too unstable to coexist with the living energy of the current time. It had to be purged. The plane's destruction was a natural consequence of this energy imbalance. But this meant they were still in danger. They were a fraction of a second ahead of everyone else, and the normal flow of time, the continuous stream of events and people, would soon catch up to them. When it did, the collision of their dead energy with the living energy of the present could be catastrophic. They would be annihilated. The only way to survive, Jenkins concluded, was to shed the dead energy. But how? The answer was chillingly simple. They had to pass through another temporal rip, a third one, that would allow them to resynchronize with the current flow of time, to re-enter the present properly. And the only way to do that was to fly again. But the plane was gone. Panic threatened to overwhelm them. How could they fly without a plane? Brian, ever the resourceful pilot, began to think. He remembered seeing an old, small private jet at the airport, a Learjet. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. The group, now united by a common, desperate goal, raced towards the private jet hangar. Their movements were imbued with a grim urgency, the awareness of their precarious existence hanging heavy in the air. Time was literally running out. They found the Learjet, but it was locked. Brian, using his pilot's ingenuity, managed to hotwire it. The engines coughed to life, a powerful, hopeful roar that pierced the lingering silence. They scrambled aboard, the group significantly smaller now. Craig Toomey, consumed by his madness and the lingering effects of the temporal shock, had vanished. He was likely consumed by his own demons, or perhaps by the residual energy of the past. As Brian prepared for takeoff, the air around them began to crackle and hum. The distant sounds of the present, once faint, grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of the world catching up, the wave of current time approaching. It was the sound of impending collision. The takeoff was a desperate race against the clock. The Learjet, lighter and nimbler than the larger commercial airliner, hurtled down the runway. Brian pulled back on the yoke, lifting the plane into the air just as the world around them seemed to shimmer and vibrate. They flew into the approaching temporal wave, a chaotic maelstrom of light and sound. The plane shuddered violently, the instruments flickered, and for a terrifying moment, they felt as if they were being torn apart. But they held on, and then, just as suddenly, it was over. The Learjet settled into a smooth, familiar hum. The world outside the windows was vibrant, alive with color and movement. Below them, they could see the bustling airport, lights twinkling, ground vehicles moving, other planes taking off and landing. They had done it. They had re-entered their own time, properly. However, the experience of being a fraction of a second ahead of everyone else had one final, profound consequence. As they landed the Learjet, the airport was full of people, but they were still a fraction of a second out of sync. They could see the people, hear them, but they were almost like ghosts, translucent, their movements slightly delayed. It was a disorienting, unsettling experience. To fully resynchronize, they had to be unconscious for that brief fraction of a second. This meant a controlled plunge into temporary unconsciousness. Brian, having successfully guided them through this impossible journey, was the last to succumb, passing out as the plane rolled to a stop. When they awoke, it was to the sounds of emergency services, of flashing lights and concerned voices. They were surrounded by paramedics, airport staff, and curious onlookers. They were finally, truly, back. The survivors were questioned, their stories met with a mixture of disbelief and concern. How could they explain what had happened? How could they convey the terrifying reality of the Langoliers, the devouring of time, the existential dread of being adrift in a temporal void? Their experiences were beyond comprehension, beyond words that could adequately capture the sheer horror and absurdity of it all. Each survivor carried the scars of their ordeal, both visible and invisible. Laurel Stevenson, the kind teacher, was deeply affected, her previous weariness replaced by a profound understanding of time's fragility. Don Gaffney, the gentle writer, found his grief over his daughter magnified by the terrifying encounter with oblivion. Albert Kausner, the young writer, had a story that would forever haunt his dreams, a tale so bizarre and unsettling that it would shape his entire perception of reality. Bethany Sims, the rebellious teenager, was stripped of her cynicism, replaced by a raw vulnerability. Nick Hopewell, the stoic agent, had faced a threat unlike any he had encountered in his world of espionage, an enemy that literally devoured existence. And Brian Engel, the pilot, the reluctant leader, carried the heaviest burden. He had saved them, navigating them through the impossible, but the images of the Langoliers, the taste of tasteless food, and the chilling silence of the devoured past would forever be etched in his memory. He had looked into the abyss of time and seen it consumed. His understanding of reality, of causality, of existence itself, had been shattered and reassembled in a terrifying new form. Their story, however, was their own. They knew the truth, and that knowledge set them apart, marking them as survivors of an unimaginable journey. They had flown through the very fabric of time, witnessed its consumption, and returned to tell a tale that no one would ever truly believe. They were the last witnesses to a time that had been eaten, the living proof of the Langoliers, the silent guardians of a horrifying secret. And as they stepped back into the bustling, vibrant world of the present, They knew that beneath its surface, the relentless munching of the Langoliers continued, eternally devouring the past, ensuring that what was gone, truly stayed gone. The silence, for them, would always carry the faint, ghostly echo of a world that had been eaten.